The door to Studio B had been open all afternoon, but the moment Whitney Houston stepped through it, the whole room seemed to close in around itself. Not violently, not with drama, just the way a room does when something is about to happen that nobody has a word for yet. It was April of 1989. The studio on Sunset Boulevard had seen its share of history. The acoustic foam had absorbed enough greatness over the decades that the engineers liked to joke it was load-bearing. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the booking sheet showed two names that nobody had thought to check against each other. One had been confirmed on a Monday. The other had been locked in for weeks. And now here they both were, in the same room, with the same microphone between them and about 3 years of unfinished business hanging in the air like smoke. But if you want to understand what happened that afternoon, if you want to understand why it mattered and what it cost and what it ultimately proved, you have to go back to 1986. You have to go back to a dinner party in Bel Air that nobody was supposed to talk about, and the one sentence that quietly changed everything. If this channel is new to you, hit that subscribe button right now, because what went down in that studio is one of the most powerful and least told stories in the history of American music. And you deserve every single word of it. The dinner was held at a private home in Bel Air in the autumn of 1986. The kind of evening where the guest list reads like a textbook index. Producers, conductors, label heads, and the artists themselves. The ones who believed in craft the way other people believed in gravity. Barbra Streisand was seated at the center table, as she always was in any room she entered, and the conversation had turned, as it always did in those years, to the new generation, to MTV, to the way pop music was reshaping itself into something that rewarded spectacle over substance, image over intention. Someone at the table mentioned Whitney Houston. By 1986, Whitney had already sold millions of records. She had been called, with increasing frequency and increasing certainty, the greatest natural voice of her generation. People said it the way people say facts, not as opinions, but as conclusions already arrived at. Barbra set down her glass. "I don't dispute the instrument," she said, the way she said everything. Measured, surgical, without a wasted syllable. "The instrument is genuinely extraordinary, but the industry has stopped asking what you do with the instrument. Whitney Houston is the symbol of that shift. Spectacular sound, spectacular packaging, but there is no real conversation happening. When you listen to technique without intention, you are essentially watching athletics. Beautiful to observe, but not art." The table went quiet, not because everyone agreed, but because when Barbra Streisand spoke with that particular tone of finality, the room tended to pause and recalibrate before anyone said another word. Those words traveled, the way words at those dinners always did. They were repeated in hallways, reshaped slightly by each retelling, carried across town and into ears they were never intended to reach. By early 1987, a version of what Streisand had said had made its way back to Whitney's camp. The phrasing had sharpened in transit, as gossip always sharpens, but the core of it held: technique without intention, athletics, not art. What those words did to Whitney Houston was not what anyone might have predicted. She didn't fire back. She didn't summon a publicist. She didn't say a single thing publicly, not then, not ever. What she did instead was go quiet, the kind of quiet that looks like composure from the outside and feels like compression from the inside. The kind of quiet that a woman raised in a Newark church, trained by a mother who demanded excellence as a baseline, navigated by an industry that wanted her to be a perfect and pleasant product. That kind of quiet was not acceptance. It was accumulation. Because Streisand's words had not landed in a vacuum. They had landed on top of everything else already stacked inside Whitney Houston by 1987. The executives at Arista, who kept steering her away from gospel and toward pop that was more broadly appealing. The vocal coaches who praised her range and then immediately asked her to dial it back. The critics who spent one sentence celebrating her voice and the next sentence asking whether she had anything authentic to say with it. All of it. The doubts and the redirections and the quiet diminishments that come with being young and black and extraordinary in an industry built by people who are none of those things. compressed and held behind a smile so convincing it sometimes fooled even the people closest to her. And now, standing in the doorway of Studio B on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1989, Whitney Houston looked across the room and saw Barbra Streisand standing near the back wall, speaking quietly with Marty Paich. The occasion was a charity compilation. Marty Paich, arranger, producer, a man who had worked with Ray Charles and Ella Fitzgerald, and who had, at 63, decided he wanted to capture something real and unprocessed before the industry changed completely, had assembled the project for the American Red Cross. The concept was uncompromising. Live performances, no overdubs, no safety nets, just the voice in the room. Barbra had agreed to participate on a Monday. Her terms were standard. Specific booth configuration, the vintage Newman U-47 she had used since the late 60s. A 3-hour window. What nobody had cross-referenced on the scheduling sheet was that Whitney Houston had been booked for the same afternoon. Marty crossed the room when he saw Whitney in the doorway, arms open, delighted in a way that suggested he understood, at least instinctively, what he was witnessing. He made the introductions warmly and formally, as if neither woman had been aware of the other's existence for years. Barbra extended her hand. Whitney took it. They exchanged the careful, courteous pleasantries of two people who have been circling each other's mythology long enough to know exactly what they are doing. Then Barbra went first. She sang the way she had always sung, with an intelligence that was almost architectural. Every phrase carried weight. Every dynamic choice was deliberate and load-bearing. You could hear the decades in it, the discipline, the craft, the total command of a woman who had spent her entire adult life in an honest and demanding conversation with a microphone. When she finished, the control room was silent long enough to become its own kind of statement. Then Marty exhaled and said quietly that it was extraordinary, because it was. Barbra stepped back from the microphone. She looked at Whitney across the room and gave a small, measured nod. One craftsperson acknowledging another. Then she moved to the side, and the room rearranged itself around what was coming next. Whitney walked to the center of the room, and then she did something nobody in that studio had seen her do before in a professional setting. She stood completely still, eyes closed, both hands loose at her sides, for nearly 30 seconds. Not reviewing lyrics, not warming up. Just standing there, holding something inside herself that the room couldn't quite see and couldn't quite name. Marty said later that he thought she had changed her mind, that the weight of the afternoon, of that room, of that specific audience, of 3 years of compression and accumulation, had become too heavy to lift. He said he was about to say something when she opened her eyes. And then Whitney Houston sang. What came out of her was not what the room had prepared itself to receive. It began lower than anyone expected, from a place in the chest that felt almost conversational, intimate in a way her recordings never quite captured, because records flatten things and rooms don't. There was no armor in it, no management, no awareness of how it was landing or what it was proving. There was instead the sound of a human being who had decided, in those 30 seconds of stillness, to stop curating herself and simply exist at full, honest volume. As the melody rose, and God it rose phrase by phrase, each one landing with the force of something both completely unplanned and completely inevitable. The air in the studio changed in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who wasn't there. The engineers stopped touching the board. Marty Paich sat down in a chair he hadn't been aiming for. The assistant near the door pressed her clipboard flat against her chest without realizing she'd done it. And Barbra Streisand, standing in the corner of that studio in her dark blazer, went completely, utterly still. By the time Whitney reached the climax, that place where the voice stopped being a technical achievement and became something closer to a reckoning, where the years of compression finally had a room large enough to expand into, there were tears on Barbra Streisand's face, not the polite tears of appreciation, the other kind, the kind that arrive before the decision to let them, the kind that come from whatever part of a person lies below the intellect, below the career, below the carefully maintained position of someone who has spent decades being the standard everyone else is measured against. When the last note dissolved into the acoustic foam, Studio B was silent for so long that the silence itself felt deliberate. Then Marty said very softly, Okay, just that. Okay, because nothing else fit. Barbra Streisand crossed the room. She walked slowly and deliberately, the way she did everything. And when she reached Whitney, she didn't offer the practiced compliment or the strategic acknowledgement. She looked at her directly and said, I owe you an apology. I said something 3 years ago that was ignorant, and I think you just explained, more clearly than I ever could, exactly why it was ignorant. Whitney held her gaze. I know what you said. Barbara nodded once. I know you know. What followed over the next hour, as the session formally concluded and the engineers began their quiet work of packing up, was a conversation between two women who had approached music from entirely opposite directions and arrived that afternoon at the same coordinates. They talked about the church, about what it means to use a gift honestly versus what it means to use it strategically, about the specific exhaustion of being a woman in a room where everyone has an opinion about what you should sound like. At one point, Barbara said, with a tone that was half invitation and half genuine curiosity, we should record together. I have a song that I think could hold both of us. I'd like you to hear it. Whitney was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. The kind of smile that was warm and absolute and left no door open. I don't think so, she said. And then gently, your songs are yours, Barbara. Mine are mine. I think that's the way they need to stay. Barbara looked at her for a long moment, and then she laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and genuine, from somewhere deeper than performance. You know, she said, that is the most intelligent thing anyone has said to me in a decade. She left the studio shortly after. The hallway was quiet. The assistant with the clipboard watched her go and then turned back toward the recording room, where Whitney was still sitting with Marty, talking softly about something neither of them would later be able to remember exactly. What the assistant remembered, what she told a journalist years later, when someone was trying to reconstruct the afternoon from fragments and secondhand accounts, was that she had never in her career felt so clearly that she had been present for something that would outlast the room. Nobody published a word about that Tuesday. No photographer was present. No publicist shaped the story. It existed only in the memories of the people who were there and in the small, barely perceptible ways that both women carried themselves afterward, as though something that had been pressing against them from the outside had quietly, finally, been pressed back. Whitney Houston never mentioned Streisand's name publicly in the context of that afternoon. Barbara never gave an interview about it, but people who knew them both, who were around them in the years that followed, said something had shifted, that a certain guardedness Whitney had carried around questions of her own artistic legitimacy had loosened, just slightly, as though she had been holding a verdict she disagreed with and had finally in one afternoon overturned it not by arguing, but by singing.